Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Athenaeum. My name is Priya Janar. I am the acting director of the Athenaeum this semester. This evening is always very special because we get to show parents and families what our students get to enjoy 4 nights a week. This is an incredibly special opportunity, unlike anything else. There is no college in the US, maybe even the world, where this is possible. A big thank you to Stephanie for being our parent speaker, Stephanie Kleine-Ahlbrandt. Her son, Adrian Flynn, is somewhere. Adrian, stand up. Okay. Adrian was a fellow last year. So thanks to Stephanie, you guys are gonna get to experience, like I said, what our students get to experience every night, 4 nights a week. Just a few additional thanks. Thank you to the parents and alumni engagement team. I don't know if anyone is here, but they did a great job curating this weekend and curating amazing SoCal weather for everyone, especially those from the East Coast. Also to my team at the Athenaeum. We have Chito, Chef Chito, raise your hand. Chito has a 6-person team, and somehow he manages to get eggs, okay? That's been a bit of a budget buster, I think, but he's managed. So with him tonight, part of his team are Chef Joe. Joe? Woo! And also Miguel. Miguel, wave. Not here are Angie, Barbara, and the pastry chef Juan. Juan is the one who uses up all the eggs, right? So, also we have our ath manager, Ashley Carlson. Ashley really, she really is the COO of the place, right? She manages the logistics. This is an incredibly busy, dynamic campus hub, and she does it all. And through it, she manages and mentors an entire army of student workers. Without the servers, many of whom, well, they're all now eating in the back, but without them, this would not be possible. So Ashley, thank you so much for doing so much. Okay, last but hardly least are our ath fellows. Ath fellows, please stand up. In no particular order, we have Melanie Calla. I think Melanie's doing the introductions tonight, right, Melanie? Melanie is a senior. She's from Orange County. She's majoring in IR. At her table, we have Olivia Licata. Olivia is an IR major also and a public policy major, and she is from Connecticut, New Canaan, right? We have Catherine Schwab from Boulder, Colorado. Kate is a dual major in PPE and economics with a sequence in data science. I had to write that down. And finally, we have Jacob Smagula, who's not here tonight. He has lab, but he's from Boston, Massachusetts, and he is majoring in government with a legal studies sequence. So these amazing leaders, and of course, Adrian from last year, I think Angie, get up. And Adrian, stand up. These are fellows from last year. These young leaders, they bring an open-mindedness, a curiosity, an ability to ask tough questions in a civil way. I think they really model these things for us, and I think it's really important. I'm so grateful to them, and I'm really grateful to get an opportunity to work with them. So thank you so much. Welcome again to the Athenaeum, everybody. Thank you. Woo!
Thank you, Priya. That was very sweet. Welcome again to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Melanie Kalla, and I'm honored to be one of your 2024-2025 Woolley Athenaeum Fellows. I'm also honored to have my parents here tonight. Due to their unconditional support, I'm able to stand on this stage and speak to you all, and I'm forever grateful for them. In fact, I would like to shout out all the parents for joining us in Claremont and supporting our students. Priya made us stand, and now I'm going to do the same to you all. Can I please have all the parents in the audience stand?
Oh.
Thank you guys so much. CMC students and parents alike have become familiar with CMC's goal of preparing the next generation of responsible leaders. But what does responsible leadership actually mean? How can you be a responsible leader when negotiating with policy stakeholders in North Korea, or working on the ground in Rwanda following the genocide? Tonight, we are lucky to hear from a speaker whose career is a masterclass in responsible leadership across frontlines, war zones, and boardrooms. Stephanie Kleine-Ahlbrandt will be sharing insights from a seasoned career in conflict prevention and defending human rights. During her time working at the United Nations, she conducted over 40 field missions across the Asia-Pacific and African countries, planned and prepared personnel for UN peacekeeping operations, and worked in Rwanda following the genocide as part of the UN's first ever human rights field operation. She also served as the finance and economics expert on the North Korea panel of experts for the United Nations Security Council. Beyond the United Nations, Stephanie established and led the Northeast Asia office of the International Crisis Group in Beijing, China, conducting research, analysis, and policy recommendations. She also worked at the United States Institute of Peace and was an International Affairs Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Stephanie currently serves as a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center, where she does critical research on North Korean domestic and foreign policy. Tonight, she will be delivering the Spring 2025 Lecture in Diplomacy and International Security in honor of George F. Kennan. And if her credentials weren't enough to deliver this talk for us tonight during Family Weekend, she is also the parent of a CMC senior. Before we begin, we ask that you please take out your devices and silence any alerts or alarms. As a reminder, video and audio recording is prohibited at the Athenaeum. Now, please join me in welcoming Stephanie Kleine-Ahlbrandt to the stage.
Good evening. It's an honor to be here at the Marion Minor Cook. Is there feedback from both? Okay, yeah. The Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum, delivering the lecture in Diplomacy and International Security in honor of George F. Kennan. We're going to speak about leadership tonight. And I know that leadership is a word that you often hear at CMC. So let's start from square one. What actually comes to mind when you think of a leader? A powerful prime minister, a CEO, a general, someone at the top making decisions, commanding attention, giving orders. What if real leadership isn't about power, but about courage? Speaking up when the stakes are high and there's a risk to safety or reputation. Telling the truth when it could cost you a relationship or a position. Taking action when it's easier and safer to do nothing. I've seen leadership tested in war zones and negotiation rooms, in crisis response and back-channel diplomacy. And here's what I've learned again and again. The best leaders share two defining qualities: integrity, or the courage to stand firm, even when truth comes at a cost. Resilience, the strength to act on that truth, even under relentless pressure. One without the other fails. Integrity without resilience burns out, leads to clarity without action, conviction without impact. Resilience without integrity bends to pressure. Survival at the cost of principle, adaptability at the cost of truth. Yet integrity and resilience are not the whole story. They are the foundation, but leadership is ultimately about people, requiring humility, humanity, and compassion. And these qualities only endure when rooted in integrity and sustained by resilience. But leadership isn't just about values. It's about how they hold up under pressure in the moments that test us most. So tonight, I want to take you on a journey. through moments in my career where integrity and resilience were tested, and what those crucibles taught me about responsible leadership. Because the greatest leadership lessons don't come from success. They come from failure, from personal missteps, from institutional failures, the collapse of moral courage. Let me take you to one of these moments. Rwanda, 1994-1995. I was there with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights investigating genocide, visiting churches that were meant to be sanctuaries but had become slaughterhouses, listening to survivors speaking in hushed tones, sharing stories no report could ever truly capture, of those who survived by hiding amongst the dead, of neighbors who became executioners overnight, the familiar turning into the unimaginable. Our mission was clear: assess the scale of the genocide, gather crucial evidence, and help rebuild a shattered judicial system to ensure accountability. But what we hadn't anticipated were the massacres still to come. This time, the perpetrators weren't those who had orchestrated the genocide. They were the new government, the same leaders who had vowed to break the cycle of violence, the same ones who had promised no revenge. April 1995, Kibeho, 9 months after the genocide. A vast, overcrowded, internally displaced persons camp. 50,000 people crammed together. Hutu civilians, former soldiers, genocide survivors, and suspected perpetrators, all trapped in limbo. Then, gunfire, stampedes, mortar shells ripping through makeshift shelters. When the last shots were fired, at least 4,000 lay dead. And the world, silent. The UN watched. Peacekeepers were ordered to stand down. No one stepped in. No one stopped the slaughter. Why? Because challenging Rwanda's new government could have consequences. It could strain diplomatic ties and jeopardize careers. Because many wanted to believe in Rwanda's redemption story, to trust its promises of justice without revenge, to believe the cycle of violence had ended, even when the evidence said otherwise. Kibeho wasn't just a massacre, it was a betrayal by those who vowed to protect, by those who chose silence, by a world that looked away. It was also a failure of responsible leadership. And the UN's response? Bureaucratic damage control, detached, procedural, devoid of urgency. Responsible leadership always comes down to a choice: speak or stay silent, act or stand by. I asked myself, if no one else would speak, could I live with my own silence? The answer was no. Before I left, I gathered everything: memos, cables, reports. There was no internet, no cloud storage back then, just battered boxes crammed with truth, carried onto a sweltering tarmac and onto the plane. Back in Geneva, I wrote a book. I knew that publishing it could shut doors for me at the UN. But I decided if truth closed doors, then those were never the doors worth walking through. And the book would not just document a massacre. It contributed to the development of the UN Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement 3 years later, the first international framework to protect internally displaced persons. A second edition even explored a haunting question: would these principles have changed the fate of Kibeho had they existed at the time? But what I hadn't foreseen was the way the truth would ripple outward. Years later, former peacekeepers, once bound by orders and institutional loyalty, came forward with their stories. Stories about the orders that kept them standing back while people were slaughtered. They told me the book helped give them the courage to speak. Because truth, once spoken, refuses to stay buried. And nearly 3 decades later, the inaction of the past still shapes the present. The same government is in power, ruling through fear and repression, assassinating critics in and outside of its borders, waging war in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, all with the backing of Western allies too invested in their own narratives to hold it accountable. Unchecked power doesn't just persist, it consolidates. And when leaders are shielded from consequences, they rule without fear. But I also learned something else. Even when institutions fail, individual action still matters. Truth has a ripple effect. Because in the end, responsible leadership isn't a title you hold, it's a truth you live by. Rwanda was not the only place where I learned that lesson. In 1995, the Dayton Agreement ended the Bosnia War, and soon after, I was sent as a human rights officer, seconded by my government to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, to assess whether Bosnia was ready for free and fair elections. It wasn't. Ballots meant nothing when war criminals still ruled through fear, when hundreds of thousands of displaced persons couldn't return home to vote, and when political dissent was silenced. We sent report after report detailing why conditions for free and fair elections simply didn't exist. Holding them prematurely wouldn't unify Bosnia. It would entrench wartime territorial gains and deepen divisions. Then a senior US diplomat made it clear to me, we are holding elections, even if the conditions aren't right. And just like that, Bosnia became a box to check. This wasn't about peace. It was about optics. It was about a political milestone. It was about a White House that needed a success story. I had a choice, stay and be complicit or walk away. The choice wasn't easy. This was a coveted post, one I had worked hard to earn. But I resigned. And what followed confirmed my fears. The 1996 Bosnian elections proceeded as planned, marred by fraud, intimidation, and manipulation. They didn't restore democracy. They erased entire displaced communities from the political map. They solidified the ethnic cleansing wrought by the war. War criminals roamed free for years, some leading factions, others shielded by the state. And NATO, it looked the other way. Its forces on the ground somehow managed to never cross paths with Radovan Karadzic or Radko Mladic, even though everyone else seemed to know exactly where they were. They were arrested only 13 and 16 years later. By then, their ideology had taken root. Justice came too late. At the time, I had feared that resigning just 5 months into my contract would close doors, that walking away would cost me future opportunities. But what stayed with me was this: I had chosen principle over complicity. Responsible leadership isn't just about standing firm. It's about knowing when to step away, especially when staying means lending credibility to a process that betrays its purpose. It means valuing integrity over career, making the hard choice, trusting your resilience to weather the consequences so you can continue to show up again and again. I had now seen two clear failures of responsible leadership, one where silence enabled a massacre, another where political convenience triumphed over justice. I was about to see what happens when leadership refuses to yield. In 1997, I was back at the UN. Lo and behold, they did let me back in. I was assigned to work with Soli Jahangir Sarabji, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Nigeria. A former Attorney General of India, he was known for his unwavering moral clarity. Where others hesitated, he acted. Where others softened their words, he made them sharper. Where others tiptoed around the truth, he walked straight through it. At first, Nigeria's military regime refused to let us into the country, so we would travel to London, where dissidents and human rights leaders could slip away to meet us. We listened, we documented, we reported. Then at last, we made it into Nigeria. One of our most pivotal stops was Ogoniland, a region at the heart of Nigeria's oil wealth and its suffering. For years, oil companies reaped billions, while local communities were left with poisoned water, dying crops, and razed homes, forcing many to flee. At our meeting place, families spoke in hushed tones, their voices carrying the weight of loss. Then came the moment I will never forget, sitting with the family of Ken Saro-Wiwa. Just 2 years earlier, Saro-Wiwa and 8 other Ogoni leaders, together called the Ogoni 9, had been hanged after sham trials. Their crime? speaking out against Shell Petroleum and the Nigerian military's devastation of their homeland. They weren't just silenced, they were executed. Grief still hung in the air, but so did quiet defiance. Their families spoke of threats, intimidation, the crushing weight of injustice, and still they refused to be silent. Solely listened deeply, unwaveringly. His presence alone was a statement of resolve. And he didn't just bear witness, he acted. We made unannounced prison visits, walking through overcrowded, stifling cells where political detainees were locked away for speaking out. We investigated extrajudicial killings and torture. Every testimony unsettled those in power. That was the point. Our report to the UN Human Rights Commission didn't just expose the brutal realities of military rule in Nigeria, it forced Shell Petroleum into the global spotlight. At the time, corporate accountability barely existed. Human rights violations, those were seen as the concern of governments, not businesses. But our report made it clear. Shell's partnership with the Nigerian military wasn't just business, it enabled human rights abuses. For months, Shell lobbied us, pressed us, tried to water down our findings. We didn't budge. And in the end, the truth forced action. Shell dismantled its private security forces. It launched environmental assessments. It pledged cleanup efforts. Although nowhere near true accountability, it marked a shift. Corporations could no longer operate in conflict zones without scrutiny. Then, ahead of Pope John Paul II's visit, we sent him a letter listing the names of political prisoners, asking that he call for their release. It worked. It was a reminder that sometimes making injustice impossible to ignore is enough to force action. Soli didn't just fight for justice, he lived it. He became not only a mentor, but a lifelong friend. He didn't believe in pretense. He believed in action, in showing up, speaking hard truths, and refusing to look away. That belief stays with me, because integrity isn't a principle, it's a choice, one we make over and over until it defines who we are. When Nigeria transitioned to civilian rule, Mary Robinson, the then High Commissioner for Human Rights, turned to me with a formidable challenge: China. Engaging Beijing on human rights was urgent, but it was also a battlefield. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, China resisted external scrutiny, viewing it as an intrusion on its sovereignty. Every conversation felt like a negotiation. We spoke on behalf of political prisoners, ethnic minorities, dissidents, pushing the limits without shutting the door. If Nigeria was a test of moral clarity, China would test whether responsible leadership could survive inside a system built to resist it. This work demanded strategy, resilience, and moral courage, qualities that Mary Robinson possessed in abundance. As former president of Ireland, she used her stature to engage directly with China's top leadership, raising human rights concerns both publicly and privately, a delicate but necessary dance. Her negotiations with President Jiang Zemin led to an unprecedented memorandum of understanding, an unprecedented opening in UN-China human rights cooperation. But responsible leadership isn't just about ink on paper, it's about what happens in the room. And one moment stands out. On her final trip to China, I accompanied Mary to a high-stakes meeting at the Chinese Foreign Ministry. The room was tense. Senior officials, visibly uneasy, tried to cut the meeting short. They dodged, they deflected. They wanted her to move on. But Mary didn't flinch. With quiet resolve, she pressed forward, relentless. She quickened her pace, ensuring that every point was made, every prisoner's name on her list was spoken. And then she did what few dared. She stepped right in front of the press. No diplomatic half measures, no watered down words. She spoke the truth, clearly, publicly, unapologetically. These moments were a masterclass in responsible leadership. Leadership that holds firm, especially when the stakes are highest. Because integrity isn't just about speaking truth to power. It's about refusing to let power reshape truth for its own convenience. I carried that lesson forward as I deepened my work on China. While working with Mary Robinson, I was noticing a clear shift. Repression was tightening, but it wasn't stopping at China's borders. Beijing was expanding its global reach through trade, diplomacy, strategic investments, shielding authoritarian regimes with diplomatic cover, economic ties, and UN vetoes, extracting resources from volatile regions, deepening its influence in fragile states. Back then, which was more than 2 decades ago, few were paying attention, but I knew I needed to understand more, to go deeper. So I took a fellowship at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, researching how China was reshaping conflicts and power dynamics, expanding its influence in ways that altered global security. But research wasn't enough. I needed to be back in action. So I moved to Beijing to open an office for the International Crisis Group, tracking how China's growing influence was affecting global and regional conflicts. I focused on identifying levers of influence within China and helping the rest of the world better understand these shifts and respond effectively. This time, I was with a non-governmental organization. No government backing, no UN passport, no multilateral shield. Even our name raised eyebrows. In China, ICG's name in Mandarin, 国际危机组织, meant International Crisis Group. But literally translated, it could also mean group creating crisis. My Chinese friends jokingly gave me the nickname the Crisis Girl. More than once, I'd wished simply that the organization had peace in its title instead. The irony? Later, when my son and I moved to DC and I worked for the US Institute for Peace, I found myself wishing that the word crisis was in the name. Because in Washington, peace doesn't exactly scream urgency. Back to China, perception was everything. It was also a relationship-driven culture where influence didn't just happen in official meetings. Some of the most revealing moments took place in informal settings, including the quiet corners of my apartment, which is here, actually, where diplomats, academics, policymakers, and journalists, both Chinese and foreign, gathered for dinner, debate, and exchange. Chinese officials from competing, siloed government agencies who rarely engaged in direct debate in formal settings found themselves in unguarded discussions, challenging perspectives they would never acknowledge in public. We brought ICG analysts from conflict zones to Beijing, not only to deepen expertise, but to create opportunities for this kind of informal exchange. But the core of our work remained our research. Over 5 years, we published more than a dozen reports on China's role in various conflict countries, providing concrete recommendations to reduce tensions. These findings didn't just sit on a shelf. They informed policy discussions, shaped debate, and reached wider audiences through articles, op-eds, and media in English, French, and Chinese. Policymakers took notice. Our research wasn't just read, it was used. Western diplomats copied entire sections verbatim into their cables, a quiet acknowledgement of its value. Though I suppose here in academe, that's just called plagiarism. But what surprised me most wasn't the influence our reports had abroad, it was how they were received inside China. Government ministries engaged with findings they couldn't publicly endorse. The Central Party School, where future Chinese leaders studied global challenges, examined our analyses. The Export-Import Bank sought our insights before making major travel and funding decisions. In a system where censorship restricted access to detailed on-the-ground research, our analysis filled a gap. Our reports weren't always welcomed, but they couldn't be ignored. Because responsible leadership isn't about saying what's convenient, it's about trying to make the truth undeniable. 5 years in Beijing passed quickly. As much as we loved Asia, it was time to bring my son back to this country and for me to decide where my work would take me next. So I re-entered the world of multilateral diplomacy, back to the UN for the 3rd time. This time I thought it would be different. Now I was an independent expert, reporting directly to the Security Council, part of a panel of experts investigating North Korean sanctions violations. Independence was the mandate. Politics was the reality. The panel was a minefield of competing national interests. 5 experts from the Security Council's permanent members, 3 more from Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, many on leave from their governments, technically independent, but far from impartial. The mandate seemed clear: follow the evidence, present the truth. In practice, facts were anything but neutral. A single piece of evidence could ignite a geopolitical firestorm: a weapons shipment, an illicit transaction flowing through a global bank, a North Korean front company embedded in international supply chains. For weeks before submitting reports to the Security Council, we argued deep into the night, running on caffeine, exhaustion, and sheer will. Every sentence dissected, every phrase a potential flashpoint. Frustration boiled over more than once. Our reports were torn apart, literally and figuratively. A laptop may or may not have been thrown. The stakes were real. A single paragraph could trigger new sanctions, unravel fragile negotiations, or force governments into confrontation. And yet, integrity meant refusing to let politics dilute the truth. And resilience meant enduring the pressure without bending. By the time I'd returned to the UN, warfare had evolved. No longer just bombs and bullets, it was code, currency, and deception. Wars waged in bandwidth and backdoors, and North Korea was ahead of the curve. Many diplomats trained in conventional warfare still thought in terms of tanks and missiles, not malware and money laundering. They didn't see that cybercrime wasn't just disruption, that it was bankrolling Pyongyang's weapons programs. The report I drafted was the first UN investigation to expose North Korea's cyber hacking program. It forced action. Governments closed loopholes. Banks tightened cybersecurity. The global financial watchdog, Financial Action Task Force, adopted new guidelines. Sanctions enforcement grew sharper teeth. But financial pressure was only part of the story. Behind the scenes, another battle raged, not over illicit finance, but over survival. UN resolutions were clear. Sanctions weren't meant to block humanitarian aid, but political maneuvering kept life-saving supplies out of North Korea, turning survival into a bargaining chip. It was the US that was deliberately stalling UN approvals for food and medicine shipments, using aid as leverage in its power struggles with Russia and China. The official US line: safeguarding sanctions enforcement. The reality: starvation as collateral damage. I wrestled with it. Technically, this issue wasn't my responsibility. It fell to another panel expert. And with so many urgent cases already on my plate, I could have easily justified staying out of it. But was that the truth, or just an excuse for complicity? There are moments when inaction is a choice to look away, to let injustice stand unchallenged. This was one of those moments, so I took it on. The Russian panel member who is technically responsible for this issue wasn't equipped for an investigation of this scale, requiring tracking denied shipments, coordinating with humanitarian organizations, and navigating complex bureaucratic barriers across UN agencies. So I did the work and he took the credit. It wasn't about recognition, it was about getting the job done. And in the end, the report marked an important turning point. Nearly every government, except the US, praised it, along with all the NGOs and humanitarian groups. And more importantly, it led to real change: faster and more transparent humanitarian exemptions, more food and medicine reaching those in need, and fewer deadly delays. But the impact didn't stop there. The findings led to official UN guidelines called implementation assistance notices to keep sanctions from blocking humanitarian aid. These guidelines extended to the other sanctions panels, helping to prevent future delays in life-saving assistance. And I realized something else. Holding the US accountable didn't just drive results. It strengthened my credibility to take on China and Russia, which made up the bulk of my investigations. I often reminded member states, my job wasn't to take sides, but to make them all equally unhappy with me. Because integrity isn't just about calling out geopolitical rivals, it's about holding everyone, including your own government, to the same standard. After years behind policy desks, in negotiation rooms, shaping strategies and policy for others to carry out, I felt a deep pull to return to where change is lived, not just debated, to the front lines, where transformation isn't theoretical, where justice is fought for, case by case, truth by truth. Lasting change generally doesn't trickle down from the top. It takes root in the hands of those who risk everything for it, such as lawyers defending political prisoners at great personal risk, activists exposing corruption despite relentless threats, human rights defenders standing between the vulnerable and those who would seek to harm them. These leaders aren't in corner offices. They're in courtrooms, prisons, refugee camps. So after certifying as an executive coach at Columbia University, I shifted my work from policy to people, from institutions to those on the ground. I began coaching and consulting to support leaders in conflict-affected states, fragile contexts, and countries in transition. Some of the work closest to my heart is with the International Legal Foundation, which defends the rights of the most vulnerable in places where justice is simply often out of reach. The legal aid lawyers I work with in Myanmar, West Bank, Tunisia, and soon Afghanistan aren't just defending individual rights. They are keeping the flame of justice alive in the world's most fragile places by defending the marginalized, challenging systemic injustice, building pathways to lasting peace so that history doesn't repeat itself. Their work isn't just about protecting individuals, it's a bulwark against repression, upholding the rule of law and the hope for democracy. But the toll of this work is heavy. In the West Bank, legal aid lawyers navigate military incursions, endless checkpoints, and home demolitions. Their clients, mostly refugee children. So their work extends beyond legal defense. It's holistic legal representation, where they coordinate with social workers because justice isn't just about the laws, it's about survival. On my last trip, the lawyer's translator shared something remarkable. He had once been a client of the International Legal Foundation. As a child, these lawyers fought for him. Now he fights for others. In Myanmar, where the unraveling since the 2021 coup continues to deepen, the lawyers operate amidst bombings, disappearances, mass displacement, and forced conscription. They defend political prisoners. They fight for the persecuted, including Rohingya children, whose very existence the government seeks to erase. And still they keep going. These lawyers are brimming with integrity. In corrupt systems, they remain incorruptible. They refuse bribes. They resist pressure. They uphold the law even when those in power mock it. But integrity alone is not enough. Not paying a bribe means they don't get access to court files until the last minute. It wears them down. When resilience fades, even the strongest leaders risk being silenced, not by failure, but by exhaustion. That's why leadership that truly makes a difference requires both integrity and resilience. Integrity keeps fighting for justice in a system rigged against them. Resilience keeps them standing when exhaustion, threats, intimidation weighs them down. For years, we thought that resilience was something you either had or you didn't. But now we understand that it's a skill, one that can be built, strengthened, and sustained. That's why my current work brings together neuroscience, organizational psychology, and coaching methodologies to help those on the front line enhance their resilience, optimize their impact, and sustain their mission over the long haul. Because leadership today, like the battles that matter most, is not a sprint, it's a marathon. We live in an era of global turbulence, a world described often as banny, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, incomprehensible. A world where stability is an illusion, where the path ahead is uncertain and the obstacles are relentless. In this turbulence, leadership isn't about power, it's about endurance. It belongs to those whose resilience and integrity don't just carry them forward, but allow them to shape what comes next. My career has taught me much about responsible leadership and its twin pillars, integrity and resilience. I faced moments that demanded everything, that tested my limits, stripped away certainty, and forced me to stand firm when retreat seemed easier. But nothing, not war zones, not high-stakes negotiations, not impossible decisions, prepared me for the stillness of that medical office, for the quiet gravity of the doctor's voice. You have stage 4 cholangiocarcinoma, a rare, aggressive, incurable bile duct cancer. No bargains, no illusions, just time slipping through my fingers like sand. In that instant, the world that I had built, the world of plans, strategies, and an assumed future collapsed. Not under the weight of undone work or untraveled roads, but with the quiet ache of time I had taken for granted. Time with my son, time with those I love. The battles, the risks, the lines I had drawn, none of them felt as urgent as the time I still wanted. With him, with them. Yet as the weight of loss settled, something remained. Not a plan, not a certainty, but a quiet knowing. Not in words or theories, but etched into the shape of who I had become. Grounded in integrity, resilience, and clarity. A map not just to endure, but for living fully, fiercely, in whatever time remains. Because responsible leadership was never about avoiding hardship. It's about how we step into it with the clarity of conviction and faith in our ability to keep showing up. A terminal diagnosis didn't shake my values, it sharpened them. Integrity isn't a badge we wear when it's easy. It's the quiet force that steadies us when the ground gives way. The anchor that holds firm when uncertainty rises like a tide. Resilience isn't just weathering the storm, it's walking straight into it. It's choosing again and again to move forward with purpose, even when the horizon dims. Trusting ourselves to walk on, even when the way is unseen. That's what responsible leadership demands. Tonight, I've shared parts of my career journey with you because the hardest decisions aren't always made at the top. I was never a prime minister, a CEO, a titan of industry, or a politician. I wasn't even the head of a UN agency. But I led in the ways that I could, by refusing to be silent, by standing firm when it mattered most, and by showing up again and again in the face of fear and uncertainty. Because in the end, responsible leadership isn't a title you hold, it's a truth you live by. Your own leadership doesn't begin someday when you get the job, the promotion, or the title. It begins now. You define who you are before the world tests you. You decide what matters before compromise tempts you. You hold the line before pressure blurs it. You claim the truths you refuse to betray. And then life will test those choices relentlessly. Some tests will be undeniable, where the choice is clear, and so are you. But most will be quieter, more subtle, a slow erosion, a series of small surrenders, a compromise so minor it seems harmless, a pressure so quiet it almost goes unnoticed, a choice that in the moment just feels easier to make. This is where resilience matters, not just in enduring but staying true, holding your values even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs you, even when the world whispers just this once. Leadership isn't granted by titles, it's defined by the lines you refuse to cross, the truths you stand by, and the convictions you never surrender. The world will test those choices again and again. When pressure mounts, when compromise feels easier, when the path ahead disappears, what will you do? Because responsible leadership isn't given, it's claimed. Not by title, not by power, but by the choices you make when no one is watching. The world doesn't need leaders someday. It needs them now. It needs you now. The test isn't coming, it's already here. So the real question isn't, will you be ready then? It's what will you choose now? Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you so much, Ms. Kleine-Ahlbrandt, for this incredible talk. This was amazing. At this point, we would love to invite everyone up to ask questions. Please introduce yourself, say your major, if you're a student, where you're from, and please refrain from asking follow-up questions. And we would love if there's multiple people who want to ask questions, please line up along the walls on either side. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was definitely one of the best talks I've heard here, and that's a high bar, although I would not have expected any less from Adrian's mother. So I wanted to ask this sort of a nuts and bolts question. Because you were in Rwanda, I figured it might be your wheelhouse. I know there was a book published, I believe, by a Canadian journalist a number of years ago. I forget the title, but it argued through mostly primary sources and interviews with perpetrators and survivors that the Rwandan genocide would be better viewed as being a mutual genocide of the Hutu upon the Tutsi, and also particularly as Kagame advanced southward, the Tutsi upon the Hutu as well. I'm curious what your view is on I guess what's been called the double genocide theory on Rwanda.
Was that the book that went into detail about the extrajudicial executions, or no?
I believe it was, yes.
Yeah. So that's an amazing book. Amazing book with it's just surprising that a country as small as Rwanda is one of the top experts in assassinating people abroad. But, basically this is a challenge that we see, right? Like, when you live through the ultimate crime, it's a trauma so large that unless you're very intentional, right, the risk is that you repeat those crimes, right? So those books are hard to write because the Rwandan government makes China look like a teddy bear. And it's an excellent book. And when I came back from Rwanda, I actually reached out to a bunch of genocide scholars with this theory, right? That once you live through the ultimate crime, you can't even see that what you're doing is the same. It's because, right, hurt people, and it's like there's no space in your heart, right? I mean, the types of things that you've lived and seen, the violence that's been committed against your people kind of leads you to be blind. And obviously there's a dehumanization aspect as well, right? Like the dehumanization with the Radio Télévision des Mille Collines was part of the preparation of the genocide, right? So yeah, I'd never heard of the double genocide theory, but I just think it's basic human nature, right? It's sort of, if you don't process these things, you're going to repeat it. And, Rwanda's hardly the only place where we're seeing that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So as someone with family from Cuba, I wanted to ask you, as I guess to the state of human rights in Cuba, particularly since Fidel handed it over to Raúl, and then more recently since Raúl handed it over to Díaz-Canel, and just the changes over time there.
It's a great question, but I am not an expert on Cuba, and I truly believe that I follow my expertise. So I can't answer that. In fact, Latin America has been kind of like a blind spot for me. I've done everything everywhere else, and I guess the assumption was always, well, Americans all speak Spanish, right? But they don't engage with all the other regimes, right? Like China, North Korea, whatever. So Latin America is a place that I love to visit, but I am by no means an expert, and so I'm sorry to disappoint you.
Well, thank you regardless.
Yeah.
First off, thank you so much for being here and sharing your story. This was really an amazing talk. So I'm a freshman here. I'm majoring in economics, as are many CMCers. And I'm left thinking a lot when this kind of discussion comes up about incentive systems. And to me, one of the fundamental challenges to responsible leadership is that there's often an incentive as a leader to look past human rights violations, to overlook what should be your responsibility as a human being. And I'm curious, if you were to speak to someone in a position of leadership to set up an incentive system for themselves or others within their organization, how would you build that to incentivize people to do the right thing?
Well, so that, for you management experts, again, I don't claim any expertise in management, but I do know Peter Druckner and culture eats strategy for breakfast. Those are things that you bake into the culture, right? And I also find it really powerful that Google decided to turn all of its research on its own internal management to figure out what makes a successful team. And they came up with, after you solve for technical expertise, it's basically psychological safety. And psychological safety is the ability to speak truth when no one around you, right? When it's risky, right? And so culture, we could have a whole discussion. Like, I do a lot of this in my coaching. Culture is like a huge ship. Once it's established, it's really hard to shift it. Culture is technically these like unwritten rules of how we relate to each other in a company. But I don't think this is rocket science. I mean, I'm not a management expert, but there's certainly a big company now that makes airplanes that has had, after a big merger, some really problematic issues with listening to dissent within the organization. And so we get people being sucked at, doors falling off, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, right? How do you incentivize it? I mean, it's something that you bake in like who your board is, who you hire, right? What kind of training do they get, right?
Yeah.
Who do you promote? Who do you not? So I don't think it's rocket science. I don't know if that helps.
No, that was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm curious if, as an American in these international spaces, specifically in human rights, if your credibility was ever questioned. I know Americans have a lot of privilege in a lot of spaces in international relations, perhaps like NGO work and human rights, maybe less so. So I'm just curious if that was something that you were aware of, or if you ever had to defend your position as an American, or just in a room where you might have been the only American there, and if that was something that you were like conscious of at all.
I mean, during my career, America was a little different than today. An American passport was a little safer than it might be now. But I have to say, like, one thing that drove me, the late human rights lawyer Michael Ratner spoke about transformation being based in love for people. So I got a huge kick out of going to Rwanda and learning some Kinyarwanda, and usually being the only white person anywhere. And I even lived with all Africans. And I remember looking in the mirror sometimes and being like, oh, wow, like now I'm white, like I'm American, right? So, and China as well, right? The thing about that's ironic is that in Rwanda, I was like welcomed as a sister, I worked in the prisons. When I left, they gave me a huge party where they'd saved up like high protein biscuits for weeks on end. And then I went through the toil of learning Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, but I'll never be accepted in China, right? Like it's the culture. So there's places where you feel it more than other places, I think. Obviously, I didn't talk about a lot of my jobs because this would have gone on forever, but I came back after Beijing. We went actually to DC and worked for the US Institute for Peace, because I was like, I'm gonna give the US government a game try again. It's just not my thing. Like, being able to have huge access to anyone at the National Security Council and like rubbing shoulders with everyone, but them listening to your advice and then doing whatever the hell they want anyway, but you can't say anything about it now because you're in the system. There were also some big management issues at the time. So it wasn't, I was like, and also just working with all Americans. God bless, Americans are great, but I don't know, it's like I've always had this thing, like the farther, like I've taken Adrian to North Korea 3 times. I traveled to Iran in the 90s. I started going to Myanmar way like in the mid 2000s, way before. It's just like I've just always been very externally focused, where the challenge is to actually make yourself relevant. It's to learn. I also have been always bilingual in French, right? So to learn, like, to make jokes and to like, so I think that it's something I've always been trying to offset through my knowledge of culture, right? But I don't feel like people really didn't think of me as like Stephanie the American. They'd say Stephanie the crisis girl or something like this, right? But I have to say also, being in Beijing with International Crisis Group, my job was basically explaining Chinese actions to Western countries and explaining Western countries' actions to Chinese officials, right? Because it's all like meddled, like it's all sort of muddled. There's a lot of conspiracy theories, right? So in that sense, like, they saw me as an American, but not a typical American, right? Because I would explain things like, this looks like the US planned this thing, but it's actually just an interagency snafu, and they didn't mean to do it, right? Or so I think like it was a decent passport. Like, I never had a problem. I did always try to travel on my UN passport so I wouldn't be as American. And to be very honest with you, if I didn't have this sweet son, Adrian, I would have lived in Asia forever. It was because I'd read the research, and you can't move a kid around during their high school years. They have to be in one place. And it was clear that he needed to be in the US. That was his country. I have another joke, but he'll kill me if I say it. But I'm going to say it anyway. So he, when he was a kid, sorry, Adrian, I get to do this. When he was a kid, we'd go to Beijing, and like, I already spoke the language. It's usually rare. Like, usually the kid learns the language first, but I'd been learning at the UN already for many years. And he would tell me, like, Mom, I don't know what you are, but I want you to know I'm American and I'm going to die in America. He was like 7 years old. So that was my order, right? It wasn't to continue to do, I was like, I had so many jobs I could have done. I could have moved to Singapore and worked for some amazing think tank. I was like, US? What? Literally, I was like, what am I going to do in the US? So then I did USIP, and then I was like, oh my God. And then, you know, it happens like that. Like, a friend of mine at the State Department's like, oh, the expert on the panel has just stepped down. Would you like to do that? And to be honest, it's like finance expert. So I literally learned it overnight and did the interview, and then I had to learn everything. This because the guy I was replacing was a Treasury official for decades. So I just had to learn everything, which is also like a good lesson for everyone. Like, you're probably going to have 16 jobs in your lifetime, minimum, given everything, given how technology, right? You're never stuck. Keep moving, you know? It's like each job is like a lotus pad, you know, like, and you're just like on it for a while, and then it starts to sink, and you're like, your learning curve maxes out. You're like, okay, I could do this in my sleep. And then you just jump to the next one. It doesn't have to be like, you know, people look back at my career, they're like, oh my God, you strategized. I literally didn't. I was like in a job until I was like, okay, this isn't really what I thought it was. I'm looking around saying, I don't really respect all these people. And then I'm like, okay, time to go. So you can just make it up. Just follow your passion, you know, and you're going to have so many jobs. In my career time, it was like everyone did, honestly, everyone in the UN stays forever because it's pretty cush, right? So leaving that was rough, to go to like the Council on Foreign Relations with like a stipend that didn't even cover my rent. But, you know, like now you can just keep moving, and you should keep moving because it really is such a great, you know, we're here to learn, right? Okay, now I'll shut up. Sorry, Adrian.
Hi, my name is Sophie. I'm an alum from the class of 2023. I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit more on how you built the skill around resilience and like what you did, what you do now, and then also specific to students and like young alumni, what recommendations you have, what advice you have to building resilience and not burning out.
I mean, there's a lot of components of resilience. I think you already have a sense of some of them. Basically, I would say that some of the cognitive sort of approaches to how you process information coming in, right? Like, how do you see whatever is happening? Is it really the truth, or is there a distortion? Maybe you're seeing this through like a all or nothing lens, right? Or you're jumping to a conclusion that's not merited. So it's tons of neuroscience stuff. Obviously, having a practice, whether it's, doesn't have to be meditation, but something where you turn off the conceptual mind, right? Basically, these things are here to deliver, I think 70,000 thoughts a day, most of which, so it's the default mode network. Basically, that's what it's called when you're just in your mind. And it's completely self-referential. It's mostly fear-based, right? It's mostly like worrying about the future or regretting the past, right? And it's like stuck in kind of like a conceptual loop, more or less. So recognizing that there's skillful ways to be in the world, recognizing that the rules are all made up, basically. Everything about, oh, you should do this first and be successful here. It's like, all it is it's your life. You're making the decisions. One thing that helps against burnout, and I think I've said it in my speech, is like pursuing your passion. Where do your interests meet the needs of the world? Because the needs of the world right now are so large that almost anything you're interested in is probably going to help, right? But if you pursue anything because you're at CMC and everyone goes into management consulting and it seems like a good choice because like it looks really successful and you get a big I don't know, like I think you really have to figure out what are your passions. And basically we can do like, there's a couple of Stanford professors who write a class, they have a book called Designing Your Life, and there's a class and it's really popular, and it's like all of us could do like 10 or more careers, right? So there's a lot of things we're interested in. And the way that he recommends to look at it is like, when in your daily life are you in flow? There's a guy named Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, and he talks about the flow state, which is when you're doing something and you lose track of time, you're just completely in it, right? You can just notice, like, take a notepad for a week and notice, like, when you're in those moments, what are you doing, right? And then, yeah, you should go meditate in a cave. You don't have to meditate in a cave. I think, for me, New York City is the best place to meditate because, you got to be in the world, right? But these kinds of practices that allow us to calm the nervous system, right? That allow us to recognize that our ancient limbic system is, here to keep us alive. So, we have the amygdala, and then we have the prefrontal cortex. And when we're stressed or under threat, the ancient part kind of hijacks everything else. The prefrontal cortex is actually needed to make decisions, to be able to listen to the person in front of you instead of just kind of be in your own position, to process language. So noticing in our body, right? So that's like Bessel van der Kolk, Peter Levine, the body keeps the score. This is all like in the water, right? But noticing what's happening physiologically in your body. Because our bodies also know things before our brains do. And there's like awesome research. I did this amazing thing it was like a program developed at Google to get all the engineers meditating. And I did that like in 2018, and it's got we had to read so much neuroscience. But, there's like an experiment they did where, there's two card decks, and you're picking, a card from the left, a card from the right one, and you're trying to maximize your sort of total points based on the cards. And what people don't realize till later is that the red deck is always negative and the right deck is always positive. And it literally, they put thermodes on people's wrists to show when they're sweating. And it takes like a dozen or so pulls before you start sweating whenever you pull the red deck. But you don't realize it till like 30 cards later. So there's like information, like feelings. It's not just like mental health and I'm depressed. That's information, right? How are you feeling in the moment when you're doing things? We are not heads on sticks, right? So I don't know, that just gave you a smattering of stuff. But, you know, I do all this stuff in Myanmar, in the West Bank. I'm soon going to Afghanistan because no one is doing anything about Afghanistan. They're just reporting on how terrible it is, right? So I have fun, like getting people together and talking about what their strategies are. And there's some super skillful stuff. And the best is when they tell me something they're doing, like in Myanmar, you know, there's a lot of violence that goes on their phones. So they do things to like not watch that or maybe tend to garden. And then I get to tell them, because I did all this neuroscience, like, oh, this is why that works. And then it's empowering them, right?
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I mean, to say thank you for what you did to my mind tonight is it's just a simple word, but you make it sound so easy. I remember growing up, my dad used to make these jokes like, all the kids in China speak Chinese. They're 2 years old. It's such a hard language. And that's what you're presenting tonight is that you simplified the term leadership for me. It's incredible. And I don't know how to ask this question, but I want to ask it, and maybe you could help me with that. So a leader is somebody that's have people walking behind them versus somebody that's a nobody just walking alone. How do you become that?
I mean, my definition of leadership is we are all leaders. I don't know if this is what you're talking.
Correct.
Like we have this traditional notion of what a leader is, but in every way, in our communities, in what like we are leading all the time in what we're doing. I mean, you guys just being at CMC are leaders because people look to you because you're smart and you went to a great college, right? And that's leadership. So I'm not one to say that leadership starts when you get a position, especially because, you know, the problem I've seen in nonprofits and why I decided to go into this coaching thing is that a lot of managers become leaders and they're no good at it because they're just used to managing, and leadership is completely different. So leadership really is like something you do now, things that you can figure out now, you know, values that you can hold now. And then through your life, whatever happens, you're just always referring back to those. Of course, that evolves, right? But yeah, I don't see leaders as a particular type of person, right? As like like only like the head of a corporation or things like that. We're simply all leaders. If I asked everyone here and I sat down and we did like a coaching thing, I would figure out all of you are leading in some way. Yeah.
Thank you again. So I'm an alumni and also a parent of 2 kids currently here, Scott Kosh, and I was a econ psychology major, so I really appreciate the riff on neuroscience. My question is about the topic of resiliency, which is sort of one of your 2 pillars that you're referring to here. In the immortal words of the American philosopher Mike Tyson, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And so there's one aspect where we're all trying to think how we can be responsible leaders in those critical moments. And it's one thing to do it once. You've done it so many times over and over again. And that really speaks to the topic of resiliency. And I wonder, how have you managed to maintain sort of optimism in the face of sort of failure of those around you, failure of institutions? Because I think it's it's one thing to do it once, it's one thing to do it multiple times. And that I think is the greater challenge. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that topic of optimism to keep fueling yourself forward.
Well, so, I mean, the very reason, like I said, that I left the whole multilateral world to become a coach was because these people I'm working with are heroes. Like in Myanmar, we've got a bunch of lawyers who are themselves displaced because, you know, the border areas are all in conflict and only about 14% of the country is stable. And then they all move to like Yangon or Mandalay, and they're living in shelters, and they're just like on their cases. There's always like you get to choose. Like, I'm not a Pollyannish person, right? People do this a lot with my cancer because it's like, oh, you've got such a great attitude. Like, I don't believe in that crap. Cancer sucks. I mean, I literally, like, you know, I was given 9 to 12 months, and I'm on an experimental treatment. There's not even a treatment for it. But I'm just keeping it real. Like, there's a part of me that truly believes that the time we get is the time we get, and that the moments that we have are more important. Like, I'd rather have this than live till I'm 90 and like not live my values, right? There was a part of me when I first got diagnosed that was like, oh, that's why I've been to like 80 countries, because I was going to have half the lifespan. I was like, okay, I did all those things. But like, I left the UN because I couldn't, like, I was going to completely, like, I had to leave physically. And like, I went to Colombia while I was still on the Security Council. So I'd go from like meeting some ambassador yelling at me to like this woo-woo, like coaching thing. But yeah, I mean, it's basically finding your people, finding what it is that really motivates you, and sticking with it, and then just never shying away from the suck, right? Like, it's never like I have huge grief over this crazy diagnosis. I've been so vital my whole life. I've like done yoga, eating salads, and like and then they're like, this cancer I've never even heard of, and it's like the average age is 74. So basically, like, once you realize life is just unpredictable, and all we're doing as humans is trying to like structure these things to make it predictable. Like, we get our houses, we get our families, we get our jobs, and we try to convince ourselves that it's all there, right? But there's freedom in recognizing that, like, there's only so much you can plan, right? And not to be like inspiration porn, but like we're
Please do.
Yeah, like, let me just be clear in case anyone missed the memo. We're all terminal. Every single person who has lived has died, but we have a crazy culture in which we never talk about it. Like, what? Like, we have like health insurance, we have like jobs, we plan our weddings, we plan our kids, and then we stop at planning our death, which is actually like the only thing that's certain. You can insure your house, but it's like, what? It's the game. Like, we are here for this period of time. And Oliver Berkman, who's a great author, he's got a book called Time Management for Mortals. It's so good. He was a columnist at The Guardian, and then he wrote this book, and he says, basically, we live 4,000 weeks. We have 4,000 weeks to live, and about a third of that is spent asleep. 3,000 weeks is not a lot of time, right? So what are you waiting for? What are you waiting for? Like, what was I waiting for? Like, after the panel, everyone was like, I got all these crazy offers, right? And then I was like, no, I'm just going to do what I love. And guess what? I did all that. I shifted everything before everyone became a coach during COVID. So, and then by the time I got my diagnosis, I was doing work I loved. And then I decided, since I'm going to die, I'm going to set up a fund. And I got all my friends, instead of sending me like cheesecakes and flowers, to like give money to this fund so that this coaching at the International Legal Foundation will go on. And that just gives me so much pleasure, right? I'm just using their emotions of like how sad they are over over my impending death to like get good stuff going. And that's basically, on people's deathbeds, there's the Harvard study of adult development, right? There's a lot of studies. No one on their deathbed says, I wish I worked like later every night. You know, like this is like known stuff. And I'm not here to like throw cold water on all the amazing grads that are going on to amazing careers, but you know, it's not the stuff that gives us satisfaction, right? Most people, it's about the quality of their relationships, which is why we have our Surgeon General before Vivek Murthy saying loneliness is like an epidemic, right? So yeah, I don't know if that gives you a sense.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for what you've done, what you're doing, and thanks for your kid.
Yeah, he's a good kid. I hear that at 8 o'clock, everything just, we all turn into pumpkins.
Hello.
Hey.
Sorry, it is. I'm just going to squeeze in real quick.
No, please.
I'm Isaiah. I'm a 2020 alum and a current staff member. Again, thank you so much for your wonderful talk this evening. You touched upon this briefly at the beginning about the ongoing conflict in Congo DRC. I know we don't have too much time, but if you can just touch upon that a little more with your expert opinion, maybe see like where you think it's going to go long term. Thank you.
Oh, I'm going to boot that one. I'm sorry.
Fair.
Yeah, it's just, it's too complicated. And like, I can't, I know a bit, but yeah. There's also a crisis group. We'd have all these people asking to predict stuff. And I was like, if they were really, really good donors and they gave us a lot of money, I would like maybe do it. But, you know, but I don't predict and I don't like, you know, navigate. There's so many amazing experts. I can give you some of their names. They're dear friends. And it would be such a dishonoring them for me to just wade into that.
When I get my raise here, I'll come back to you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, well, that wraps up the Q&A. Thank you so much for being here, for your amazing talk, for fostering such great conversation. And we just really appreciate you being here at CMC. And thank you to all of our amazing question askers and to all of our parents for coming here. This was really special. Hope you had a great time. We hope to see you at the Ath again soon. Have a good night.